Hey everyone, welcome to episode 83 of the Talking Fires podcast. Your host Ben Fadden here today. As the Holiday Bowl unfortunately just got canceled between UCLA and North Carolina State due to UCLA's kind of COVID problems, which is unfortunate. I came here today with that canceled. Just wanted to talk some Padres baseball because it's kind of unfortunate that the San Diego sports. It's an event that that San Diego was waiting for 2 years with one not happening last year. This would have been the first Padres or first football game at the Padres Stadium, Petco Park. They spent a long time making that field and preparing, obviously, and so to all that to not even come to fruition and not even to see a game played uh, with less than 4 hours before the game was supposed to start, UCLA having that COVID issue. It's really unfortunate, but I wanted to talk about it. Kind of just a thought popped in my brain today, just to talk about on this episode 83 of the Talking Fires podcast, is about Tony Gwynn never winning an MVP award. He's viewed as arguably the best hitter of all time, the best hitter of all time if you talk to most San Diegans, with a little bit of bias there, but it's pretty much him, Babe Ruth, and Ted Williams, right? I mean, you could argue Barry Bonds, but I'm in one of the crowd that, just makes him not even one of the choices in this debate because of the way that he cheated. But you could go of various ways, but I think Tony Gwynn easily is a top five hitter of all time. To really, regardless of who you speak to, he has an award named after him. So I wanted to just talk about just how weird it is that Tony never won an MVP award, regardless of all the Silver Sluggers he won, the All-Star appearances, the Gold Gloves he won. He won multiples of them, and obviously he's a Hall of Famer. Just it's just really really mind-boggling to me that he never won an MVP. And so today I wrote in my notebook a bunch of stats, compared his years all the way, pretty much his whole career, to every award winner that won that year in the National League, obviously, not the American League because he could never win that, obviously, only in the National League where he was with the Padres. So before we get kind of started, there are 2 years. That's kind of the main thing here. There are 2 years where I think you can make a good argument that he should have won an MVP. And because an MVP is one of those things that it's like, well, you were the best player in the world that season. I mean, that's an accomplishment. Most MVP award winners have a strong chance of making the Hall of Fame. He obviously did it without an MVP. So, I mean, it obviously can be done. Only two guys can win it in Major League Baseball, one from each league every year. But it's just weird that he never won one. I'm starting the comparisons that I wrote down in this book from 1984, which was his first full season of playing over 100 games, and ended the comparison in 1999 because that was his last All-Star season. So I wanted to measure the years where he actually had a chance of winning, right? He played, a lot of games. He was producing at a high level most of the time, just so it was fair. I wasn't comparing his rookie season where he played like 50 games to the MVP winner. That wouldn't be fair to him. But so there were years, right? So there are years where he didn't have a shot, right? The voters got it right. And that was pretty much from 1984 to 1999, all but two seasons in my mind, right? 1984, his first All-Stars, he placed third in the MVP voting. That was the highest that he ever placed in the MVP voting, which was also another kind of mind-boggling thing to me. Like Tony Gwynn, Hall of Famer, one of the greatest hitters of all time. He didn't even place second one year. Third was the highest, and it was his first All-Star season in '84. And that was when he lost to Ryan Sandberg. That year, he led the National League in average at 351. He played more games than Ryan Sandberg did, but that was another year where he didn't really, he wasn't going to win. Comparing WAR wasn't a big thing back then because analytics weren't really used. It was just the basic stats, which is usually kind of what I used here. games, WAR, average, on base percentage, slugging percentage, home runs, and RBIs. Those were the main ones that I used, just so it was kind of fair across the board. I used WAR because I'm a big fan of WAR. I think it's, something. It's it's not everything, but it is something, because it's a full, encompassing stat where, they measure the defense, the offense. I don't really know too much on how they calculate it, but for, dummies, the higher the WAR, the better, the more valuable you are to the team. It stands for wins above replacement. So how many more wins did you contribute to your team's season than a replacement AAA player would have? And that AAA replacement player is 0 wins. So like Tony Gwynn, for example, in 1984, 6.3 WAR. So he produced 6.3 wins more than the replacement player that would have replaced him. So that's a really good season. That's like an MVP season, what we're seeing, guys, with 6 WARs. That's like a really top all-star. You're going to get some MVP votes there. So now there were some seasons. So 1984 wasn't really an option. Ryan Sandberg, 8.6 WAR, 8.6 WAR. 1985, Willie McGee had a WAR 3 wins higher. So, I mean, you're just not going to win that. He had 82 RBIs compared to Tony's 46. Now, RBIs weren't, that was actually kind of bigger than it is now, just because, again, back then it was basic stats. So I will get to the 2 years that I believe Tony had a real legit case of winning the MVP, where he obviously didn't, because, again, I'm sure I'm not the only one, right, that found it mind-boggling that he never won an MVP before. But 1984, Ryan Sandberg won. 85, Tony didn't really have a realistic shot against Willie McGee. Had a great year there. 1986, Tony so he played the same amount of games as Mike Schmidt, who ended up winning with the Phillies. He had a higher WAR, he had a higher batting average, but lower on base, lower slugging, lower home run total, lower RBIs, like drastically. Like Mike Schmidt had almost more than double the RBI and home run totals. So didn't really have a chance there. 1987 is one of those seasons that I will get to that I think he had a really good shot of winning the MVP, and that was Andre Dawson ended up winning with Chicago. The other year is 1995, which I'll get to, which I thought he had a good year. That was Barry Larkin ended up winning. But 1988 didn't really have a good chance. He did lead the National League in batting average, but then his WAR wasn't even close to Kirk Gibson of the Dodgers. Again, Kirk Gibson, 25 home runs. Tony only had 7. So you get what I'm saying? Like, there's years where he just didn't stack up, and the voters got it right. But it's Tony freaking Gwynn, Like, you'd think that he'd win an MVP at some point. 1989 against Kevin Mitchell. Again, Tony's WAR 2.5, Kevin Mitchell 6.9. So that's a big gap there. 1990, Barry Bonds. Holy cow. I mean, he almost had a 10 WAR. That's like, you don't see that in Major League Baseball now. He had a 9.7 WAR, played in more games than Tony, almost had the same batting average, 114 RBIs, 33 bombs. Tony's WAR there, 2.9 compared to 9.7. Literally, that was like the biggest gap he probably ever faced in his career in terms of WAR in the MVP race, not even close. He was pretty close WAR-wise to Terry Pendleton of the Braves in 1991. 0.5 away there. But Pendleton led in every statistical category that I mentioned earlier. So I didn't count that there as a year that might have, he could have won. Barry Bonds again had a 9 WAR in 1992, not beating that. 93, Barry Bonds had a 9.9 WAR, so even better than 1990. Tony had a 3.1 WAR, which is still a good season. Obviously not MVP. 1994 strike year. Here's another year that would have probably been my 3rd year if I had a 3rd year. I only have 2, but if that was a 3rd year, this would probably be the year where he had a case. Obviously, that was the strike shortened year. He had played the same amount of games as Jeff Bagwell, who ended up winning the award in 1994 with Houston. Bagwell's WAR was 4 wins higher than Gwynn, so that is a big gap. But Tony, a historic season. Ted Williams was the last to hit over 400, and Tony, I believe, would have gotten it if that season, continued. He finished with 394. Obviously, they have that drink now in memory of that season. He led the National League, obviously, in average at 394, led the National League in on-base percentage at 454. So I guess that is, just because of how historic that batting average was, that would be my third season if I had one where he had a chance to win, and you could have made an argument, but Bagwell did have the better overall season and obviously had the better WAR. As we continue here, 1995, again, that was the Barry Larkin year. That was my second year, which I'll get to, that I think he had an argument to win. 96, against his teammate Ken Caminetti. He just didn't play enough games. 2.3 WAR. Yeah, he led the National League in average, but he only played 116 games compared to Caminetti's 146. And Caminetti carried that team, a 7.6 WAR, 130 RBIs, a 40 home run season. And it's a Padre. I'm not going to get mad at that. So great season out of there from Caminetti. 1997, Larry Walker went absolutely nuts. So you can't fault the voters for voting for Larry there. Yes, it was in Colorado, but a 9.8 WAR, 9.8 WAR. That is absolutely ridiculous. He almost hit 50 home runs, 130 RBIs. Absolutely ridiculous. 1998 was Sammy Sosa's year, 6.5 WAR. Tony only played 127 games, just not enough games. Sosa, 66 home runs. Again, that was the home run chase year that he lost to McGuire, but he was better overall than McGuire, so the award went to Sammy. And then 1999, Chipper Jones. Again, Tony just didn't play enough games, only 111. Chipper took home the award for playing for the Braves. Almost had a 7 WAR, 45 homer season. So you can't really make the argument that Tony deserved it there. Just didn't play well enough. But again, so this is what I did. Literally this morning, I went through just the notebook, went through all the years, all of his great years. So just to make it fair for Tony, if you can see it here, let me see here on YouTube, just a notebook of the years that Tony could have won. Sorry, you can't really see it too well because of the background, but I might send out a picture later. But now, I did want to get to the 2 seasons that I think Tony had an argument to win the award. One season, I believe, was higher than the other, so I'll start with the second season that had the second best argument of his career that he could have taken home the award, and that's in 1995. Again, like I mentioned, Barry Larkin won that award. He played 131 games, had a 5.9 WAR, hit 319, 394 on base percentage, a 492 slugging, 15 home runs, 66 RBIs. Again, Barry Larkin, shortstop for the Reds, took home the award. But I think Tony has a really fair argument here. And as I talk about that argument, I'll share the screen kind of comparing the 2 players. This was 87, which we'll get to, but here's 1995. Tony Gwynn on top here for the YouTube audience, and Barry Larkin on the bottom, highlighted in orange. Tony finished in the MVP race. He finished 9th, won a Silver Slugger, had an All-Star appearance, and I think he had an argument over Barry. Obviously, a 9th place finish. I think that's really disrespectful to Tony compared with the year that he had. In comparison to Barry Larkin, Tony played more games, had a higher batting average, higher on base percentage, drove in 24 more runs than Barry did, and he had a second straight All-Star game appearance. Like I mentioned, so that's his 1995, excuse me if I could talk, his MVP case that year isn't as realistic as 1987, which I'll get to, because Barry Larkin's WAR was over double what Tony's was. Again, Barry was at 5.9, Tony was at 2.3. So that's a big gap there. But in terms of the stats, just comparing the 2 to one another, again, Tony and this was things I did want to mention, this is things that people cared about back then, because it wasn't, it's not these big, splits like how'd he do in high clutch situations, just the basic stats. Tony, again, played in more games, right? Availability is the best ability, had a higher batting average, which was heavily weighed, arguably the heaviest weighed back then, because again, it was just a simple stat. How many times did he get a hit in his at-bats? Had a higher average there. led the league that year in average with hitting 368 compared to Barry's 319. Again, so higher average than Barry had. He had a higher on-base percentage, drove in 24 more runs. That's not, a small 5 RBI margin. That's a big margin. And then the second straight All-Star appearance. So you could make an argument that year. That's my second biggest argument year for Tony, in favor of Tony, that he could have won the MVP award. Now, Barry fans, obviously, they're going to point to that WAR and just how he was a better, I guess, overall player you can mention. He won a Silver Slugger that year, but Tony did as well. And both were All-Stars. Yes, Barry won a Gold Glove and Tony didn't. But in terms of offensive stats, you could make the argument because there are some big offensive categories back then that people weighed pretty big, significantly, that Tony he edged Barry in. But so that was one year that I think Tony, if he wasn't going to win the MVP, he should have placed way higher than 9. That's my opinion. Yes, I'm a Padres fan. Yes, you could call me biased, but I did use numbers there to back that up. My big one here is 1987. Here, I switched to 1987 for the YouTube audience on Baseball Reference, and this is the big one. Tony placed 8th. That's hugely disrespectful, in my opinion, based on the year that he had. This was his best chance, in my opinion, to win the award. It was not the best. It was not the highest that he placed. Again, 1984, he placed 3rd. That was the highest that he placed ever in his career for an MVP. But in terms of the numbers, in comparison to the player that won the award, that took home the NL MVP, 1987 for me, that was the year. So let's start here, 1987, comparing Andre Dawson, who ended up winning, with Tony. Tony, in comparison to him, in 1987, again, Tony placed 8th. He should have placed way higher than that. He played in more games than Dawson. In 1987, played 157 games. He played more games than Dawson. He had more than double his WAR. Let's see, 1987 in my notebook here. 1987, Tony's WAR 8.6, and Andre Dawson's WAR was 4. So that's a huge gap right there. I mentioned the gap between Tony's WAR and Barry Bonds' WAR. So obviously Barry Bonds, obviously easily took home the award there in comparison to Tony. It wasn't close. For 1987, it's flipped here. It's not even close, and it's in favor of Tony. 8.6 WAR in comparison to Andre's 4. Now, I know that WAR wasn't really a thing back then, but now that we have those stats here, it's still a fun thing to see and compare. Like, holy cow, Tony had a much better overall year if you're a big believer in WAR like I am, in comparison to Andre Dawson. So again, played in more games, had more than double his WAR, had a better batting average. He hit 370. Andre hit 287. Tony had a 447 on base compared to Andre Dawson's 328. So these are big gaps. I'm not like being, cherry picking these things. These are big gaps. Yes, Andre beat him in slugging percentage and in RBIs and homers, but look, I think you need to mention this, and I think we can mention it now too, unless, it's a lesser degree, just because everyone's kind of turned into a home run hitter. That's just the way that it is with the whole launch angle and the league changing the balls and all that, which obviously reports have shown that they have. Obviously playing in Colorado has an effect, but Tony's home runs and RBI totals, especially in 1987, those aren't amazing, right? We can all agree those weren't amazing stats. Only 7 home runs, but you have to, I think, look at his numbers in a different lens than Dawson. Dawson was viewed as a power hitter, and he obviously showed that, while Tony was showing his value in a different way, in a different role. He was in a different role than Andre was with the Cubs. Tony was in a role batting leadoff, batting second, just in a role where his job was to get on base and be the table setter for the power hitters, right? The power hitters in the lineup, the Steve Garveys of the world, like Tony did in 1984, for example. So he was still valuable, even though the power, the RBI numbers might not show it. He was more valuable, in my opinion, in his role than Andre was in his role. I know Andre had the power numbers, but in terms of overall, which is what we're supposed to be viewing this of, not just offense, the WAR was off the charts in comparison to Andre Dawson. Obviously, looking back at it now, Tony took home a Gold Glove, took home a Silver Slugger, just like Andre did. They both were all-stars. So I don't want to make it seem like Andre sucked. He still deserved it, but I think that Tony, he deserved it more in 1987 than Andre did. When you add up everything, the games played, the higher average, obviously the ginormous gap in WARs between Dawson and Tony, the higher on base percentage, leading the league in hits that year with 218. So just all those factors, I think Tony had a better argument. I know it's a Padres fan. You can call me biased, but I think he had a better argument than Andre did that year. That's all I'm saying. So Cubs fans want to come at me, go ahead. But that's my opinion there. There were a lot of years where Tony, this morning I thought there were going to be more years than there was where he had a better argument to win the award. I only found two kind of that you could, make that argument just based on their numbers compared to the person that won it, not necessarily in comparison to the players that placed in front of Tony, but didn't win it, but the person that won it, because obviously he's the one that won it. So that's where it makes sense. So I think 1987 was his best chance. 1995 was his second. And then if you want to go a third, 1994, just because of the history, and just how historic that year was going to be if that strike did not happen. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Again, this is episode 83 of the Talking Friars podcast. Ben Fadden here. Stay tuned to the social medias for all the lockout updates. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, about this whole Tony Gwynn not winning an MVP in his career. Just a random thought that kind of popped in my head today, and I figured to talk about it, see what other Padres fans thought about him not winning, and if you kind of agree with me, especially my 1987 viewpoint about him over Andre Dawson. Same thing, kind of to a lesser degree with 1995 and then 1994 and Bagwell won it in that shortened season. Just what your thoughts on Tony never winning an MVP despite all the Silver Sluggers, the Gold Gloves, obviously being in the Hall of Fame, obviously being deemed one of the best hitters of all time, but not taking home an award. Love to hear your thoughts on social media, in the replies on YouTube. Obviously, if you listen to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, let us know via social media. Until next time, let's go Padres, and thank you so much for listening and or watching.